My name is Lucas, and if you had asked me just a few months ago, I would have told you with absolute certainty that I was the luckiest man alive because I had found the kind of love that people spend their entire lives searching for but never quite catch. A love so pure and effortless that it felt like stepping into a world where all the noise and chaos faded away every time I looked into her eyes. I met Emily on a random Sunday afternoon at a flea market in Austin, Texas. The kind of accidental meeting you read about in novels where two strangers reach for the same vintage record at the same time and laugh over the coincidence, and somehow in that simple exchange a whole new story begins without either of you realizing how much it's about to change your life. She was wearing a sundress patterned with tiny blue flowers and a pair of worn-out Converse sneakers, and when she smiled it was like the whole world tilted slightly toward the sun. And I know that sounds dramatic, but there are some moments in life that feel too big to be contained by ordinary words. We spent the rest of that afternoon wandering through the market together, sharing sips of lemonade from a plastic cup and laughing about how neither of us was actually planning to buy anything but just needed a break from the monotony of life, and maybe the universe was tired of waiting for us to meet, so it decided to give us a little push. That night we sat on the tailgate of my truck eating greasy tacos from a food truck and talking about everything from childhood dreams to the worst dates we'd ever had, and by the time I dropped her off at her apartment it already felt like we had known each other for years instead of hours. Over the next few weeks we became inseparable, spending every free moment exploring dusty bookshops, trying weird fusion restaurants neither of us could afford, and finding hidden trails outside the city where we could pretend for a little while that the rest of the world didn't exist. Everyone around us saw it too. My friends joked that I was a goner, that I had that stupid grin you only get when you found someone who feels like home. And even my notoriously skeptical older sister gave Emily her rare and begrudging approval after just one dinner, which I thought was a miracle in itself. It wasn't perfect, of course, because no relationship ever truly is, but the imperfections felt small and manageable, like background static on an otherwise beautiful song, and every time Emily looked at me with that mischievous twinkle in her eye, I was certain that whatever came our way, we would face it together. I wasn't naive. I wasn't some lovesick teenager blinded by hormones and fairy tales. I knew love took work and patience and compromise, but for the first time in my life, I didn't mind the work because being with her made everything feel lighter, even the heavy stuff. As the summer faded into fall and the Texas heat finally loosened its grip on the city, Emily and I found new rhythms in our relationship, rhythms that felt like second nature, from Sunday morning farmers markets to spontaneous midnight drives where we would chase the stars beyond the city lights, laughing and talking about everything and nothing all at once. And I found myself daydreaming about a future that seemed so solid, so inevitable that I could almost reach out and touch it. We started leaving little things at each other's places, a toothbrush here, a sweatshirt there, a favorite mug tucked onto the wrong shelf, as if our lives were stitching themselves together one small thread at a time without either of us needing to force it. And I remember thinking that love shouldn't feel like a puzzle you have to solve, it should feel like breathing. And with Emily it did. She had this way of making even the most mundane moments feel electric, like how she would dance barefoot in my kitchen while cooking pancakes, or leave ridiculous doodles on sticky notes for me to find tucked into my backpack before work, and every small gesture made me fall a little deeper in a way that didn't feel scary. It felt like finding the place you were always meant to call home. We took a weekend trip to New Orleans in October, staying at a rundown but charming bed and breakfast where we spent hours wandering through crooked streets and listening to jazz spill out from open doorways. And somewhere between beignets and bad poetry slams, I realized that I wasn't just in love with her, I was building a life around her, a future that had her laughter in it, her dreams woven into mine, her hand reaching for mine in the dark without hesitation. It wasn't long before I started thinking about proposing, not in the distant maybe someday way, but in the real tangible sense, where I found myself casually looking at rings when I thought she wasn't paying attention and calculating how long it would take me to save up for something worthy of her, even though I knew deep down that Emily wasn't the kind of woman who cared about diamonds or carats. She just wanted real. She wanted promises made quietly and kept loudly. I talked to my best friend Jonah about it over beers one night at a dive bar we used to haunt in college, and even he, who was notoriously allergic to anything remotely resembling commitment, clapped me on the back and said if anyone deserved that kind of happiness it was me, and that was all the confirmation I needed. I started planning how I would do it, picturing all the ways I could make it perfect, because she deserved nothing less, and every time I caught her smiling at something stupid or singing off-key to songs she barely knew, I knew with absolute certainty that asking her to marry me would be the best decision I would ever make in my life. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that even the strongest loves can be built on cracks you don't see until it's too late, and that sometimes the people who feel like home are just really good at making you forget that even the safest houses can collapse when the foundation isn't as solid as it seems. It was around late November when I first started noticing the smallest shifts, the kind that you could easily dismiss if you weren't paying attention, or if you wanted so badly to believe that nothing had changed that you convinced yourself it was just your imagination playing tricks on you, because we were still laughing, we were still touching, we were still doing all the things couples do, but every so often there would be a flicker in her eyes, a hesitation in her smile, like a radio station losing its signal for a split second before snapping back to clarity, and even though I tried to shake it off, there was a gnawing feeling in my chest that I couldn't explain. She became more distracted, her phone suddenly a permanent fixture in her hand, her responses to my texts slower, her excuses for being too tired or too busy, stacking up like small paper cuts that didn't hurt much individually but left you bleeding when you weren't paying attention. And even though I wanted to trust her with everything in me, the little inconsistencies began to add up in ways I couldn't ignore. There were canceled plans that didn't quite make sense, late nights at work that didn't match her usual schedule, and the worst part was that whenever I asked about it, she would brush it off so effortlessly, so casually, that I almost felt guilty for even questioning it, because Emily was good at that, good at making you feel like doubting her was a failure on your part, not a reflection of anything she was doing wrong. I remember one night, specifically a cold Tuesday, when she told me she had an office happy hour, and I decided to surprise her afterward, thinking maybe we could grab late-night burgers like we used to. But when I pulled into the parking lot outside her building, there was no sign of her car and no sign of any happy hour crowd, just a few scattered cars and an empty lobby glowing under the flickering fluorescent lights. I sat there for a long time, longer than I care to admit, staring at my phone, debating whether to call her or just drive away and pretend I hadn't been foolish enough to catch myself doubting the woman I loved more than anything. And eventually I did drive away, telling myself that everyone deserves a little space, that not every unanswered question is a warning sign, that sometimes people are just busy and tired and human. I wanted so badly to believe that, because admitting anything else would have meant unraveling the dream I had built around her. And at that point, my dream was stitched so tightly into my bones that pulling at one thread felt like it would tear everything apart. December rolled in with its cold mornings and string lights and endless reminders that love was supposed to feel magical this time of year. But for the first time since meeting Emily, I felt a growing distance between us that I couldn't seem to bridge, no matter how many thoughtful gestures or late-night talks I tried to initiate. And even though she smiled and kissed me and whispered "I love you" into my hair as we drifted off to sleep, there was a hollowness to it, like a beautiful house with all the lights on but nobody home. I blamed the holidays at first, told myself that work stress, family obligations, and general end-of-year exhaustion were the culprits, and that once we got through the chaos, things would settle back into the easy rhythm we had always shared. But deep down I knew better. I could feel it in the way she pulled away, first from kisses that lingered a second too long, from conversations that tried to dig deeper than surface level, from plans for the future that once felt thrilling but now seemed to make her shift uncomfortably in her seat. There were moments when it was almost unbearable, like the night we went to a Christmas party hosted by one of my coworkers, and she spent most of the evening glued to her phone under the table, barely pretending to engage with the people around her, offering polite smiles and one-word answers. And when I asked if everything was okay, she said she was just tired, and I nodded, pretending to believe her, even though my gut screamed otherwise. The worst part wasn't the changes themselves, it was the way she made me feel crazy for noticing them, as if the simple act of asking for reassurance was a betrayal of trust instead of a natural response to the growing chasm between us. And somewhere along the way I stopped asking, because it became easier to accept the half-truths than to face the full truth that was becoming harder to ignore. I spent Christmas morning alone in my apartment, surrounded by the gifts I had carefully chosen for her, stacked neatly in the corner, because she had told me last minute that her family needed her back home, and she didn't want me to feel obligated to tag along, but we would celebrate properly when she returned. And even though a part of me wanted to believe her words, the larger part of me knew that something had already shifted so profoundly that no amount of wrapping paper or promises could fix it. I didn't hear from her much that week, just a few scattered texts and short phone calls that sounded rushed and distant, and I told myself not to overthink it, not to let my mind spiral into worst-case scenarios. But it's hard not to spiral when you've already started building a life with someone, only to realize they might have been building an escape plan while you were busy picking out rings. New Year's Eve arrived, and with it came a kind of desperate hope that maybe this was the night things would turn around, that maybe if we clinked glasses under the fireworks and kissed at midnight, all the doubts and fears would be washed away by champagne bubbles and good intentions. But even as I stood there in the crowded downtown square watching couples wrapped around each other in messy, beautiful affection, I knew deep down that Emily wasn't coming, not because she didn't want to, but because something inside her had already left long before her body would follow. She sent a text an hour before midnight, apologizing profusely, saying her flight had been delayed due to weather and she was stuck in her hometown for another night. And I wanted so badly to believe her, to believe that she was just as heartbroken about it as I was, but the words felt hollow and mechanical, like they had been copied and pasted from a script she didn't even believe in anymore. I went home alone that night, curled up on the couch with a cheap bottle of whiskey and the TV flashing reruns of countdowns I wasn't part of, and for the first time in months, I let myself cry, not just because I missed her, but because I missed the version of myself who still believed that love could conquer everything if you just wanted it badly enough. January dragged its feet with cold mornings and heavy skies, and I threw myself into work, into running, into anything that would keep my mind from wandering back to her, from replaying every every moment, every kiss, every whispered promise that now felt like it belonged to someone else entirely, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't outrun the memories that clung to me like a second skin. When Emily finally came back to Austin, she was different in ways I couldn't quite name, but could feel like a wrong note played on an otherwise perfect melody. And even though she smiled and hugged me and acted like nothing had changed, her eyes betrayed her because they no longer looked at me, they looked through me, past me, beyond me. We tried to pick up where we left off, forcing laughter and conversation like actors stuck in a bad play, but the spark, the effortless connection that once made even the quiet moments between us feel electric, was gone, and no amount of pretending could bring it back. I knew it was only a matter of time before everything we had built would come crashing down, but I still wasn't prepared for how or when it would happen, because love has a way of blinding you to the inevitable right up until the moment it burns you beyond recognition and leaves you wondering how you ever thought you were fireproof. It happened on a rainy Thursday evening, the kind of evening where everything feels heavy and slow, and you can almost hear the sound of the world holding its breath. When I came home earlier than usual after a client meeting got canceled, and I thought maybe we could salvage the quiet night together, maybe watch a movie, order some takeout, and pretend for just a few hours that we were still us. But when I opened the door, the apartment was too quiet, too still, and I knew before I even saw her that something was wrong, because Emily never sat in silence like that. She was a whirlwind of noise and light and movement, but that night she was curled up on the edge of the couch, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. She didn't look up when I walked and didn't smile, didn't say my name, and the dread that had been growing quietly in my chest for weeks suddenly exploded into full-blown certainty, because some silences are louder than screams, and some moments you can feel snapping your life in half before a single word is spoken. I sat down across from her, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it, and I asked what was wrong, even though I already knew. And when she finally met my eyes, there was no anger, no defensiveness, just a kind of resigned sadness that was somehow worse than any fight we could have had, because it meant she had already made her decision long before I even walked through that door. She said my name quietly, almost tenderly, and then she told me the truth, that there was someone else, that it hadn't meant to happen, that she hadn't planned it, but somewhere along the way she had gotten lost and found herself leaning on someone else in ways she should have only leaned on me. And by the time she realized how deep she was, it felt easier to keep drifting than to turn back and face what she had broken. I sat there frozen while she talked, not really hearing the words, just feeling them like punches to the gut, each one knocking the air out of me, because it wasn't just about betrayal, it was about the realization that the life I thought we were building together had been crumbling behind my back piece by piece, while I smiled and made plans and dreamed about a future that only I was still fighting for. She said she was sorry, she said she loved me, she said she wished she had been stronger, but love isn't measured by wishes or apologies, it's measured by actions and choices, and somewhere along the way she had chosen someone else, even if she hadn't said it out loud until now, and no amount of regret could erase that fact. I don't know how long I sat there after she finished speaking, because time stopped meaning anything once the world I had built around her started collapsing in on itself, and all I could do was sit in the wreckage, trying to catch my breath and piece together how we had gotten from dancing barefoot in the kitchen to confessing betrayal under the flicker of the living room light bulb that buzzed softly overhead like a cruel reminder that life keeps moving even when your heart forgets how. She didn't cry, not really, and I didn't scream, even though part of me wanted to tear the whole apartment apart just to find some physical outlet for the pain clawing its way up my throat. And instead we just sat there in the suffocating silence, both of us knowing that nothing we said now would matter, because the damage was already done, and no amount of apologies or explanations could rewind the clock to a time before trust had been shattered beyond repair. Eventually she asked if I wanted her to leave, and it struck me as almost funny in a sick, twisted way, because she had already left long before this conversation ever happened, and the only thing left behind was the shell of a love story we had both outgrown without realizing it until it was too late. I told her yes, because I couldn't imagine spending another minute pretending that we could ever go back to what we were, and she nodded as if she had expected that answer all along, standing slowly like someone much older than 26 years should have to feel, gathering her jacket and keys with shaking hands and pausing at the door just long enough to say she was sorry one last time. I didn't say anything back because there was nothing left to say, and as the door clicked shut behind her, I felt the weight of all the unsaid things settle onto my chest, heavy and suffocating, but also strangely clarifying, because in that moment I realized that sometimes the cleanest breaks hurt the worst, but also heal the fastest, because there's no more wondering, no more what ifs, just a brutal, painful honesty that cuts deep enough to leave no room for illusions. I stayed on that couch for hours after she left, staring at the empty space where she used to sit at the coffee table, cluttered with memories and broken promises, and somewhere around 3 in the morning I finally stood up, feeling older, heavier, emptier, but also oddly lighter, as if shedding the future I had imagined with her made room for a future I hadn't dared to dream of yet. The days that followed felt like walking through a house that had burned down and still smelled like smoke, even though the flames were long gone, because everywhere I looked I saw pieces of her, pieces of us, and it was a special kind of torture trying to decide whether to cling to those memories or tear them down piece by piece until there was nothing left to mourn but the empty spaces we once filled together. I threw myself into work, into running, into anything that would exhaust my body enough to quiet my mind at night, because that was when the memories crept in the strongest, filling the silence with echoes of laughter and whispered promises that now felt so foreign. It was like they belonged to a different lifetime, a different person altogether. My friends tried to help, dragging me out to bars and introducing me to people I had no interest in meeting, telling me that the best way to get over someone was to find someone new, but I knew deep down that wasn't what I needed, because healing wasn't about distraction or revenge. It was about learning how to be whole again without depending on someone else to fill the cracks. There were nights when the loneliness felt unbearable, when the apartment walls seemed to close in on me, and the temptation to reach out to her just to feel something familiar burned so hot that it physically hurt to resist. But I did resist, not because I hated her, but because I loved myself enough to know that reopening that wound would only prolong the bleeding. Slowly, painfully, I began rebuilding my life, starting with the smallest things like changing the sheets on the bed and buying new mugs for the kitchen, because even the most ordinary objects carried weight when they were tied to memories you no longer wanted to carry, and each small act of reclaiming my space felt like a tiny victory, even if it didn't erase the hurt. I started writing again, something I hadn't done since before I met her, pouring my confusion, my anger, my grief onto paper in messy run-on sentences that made no sense to anyone but me, and in doing so I found pieces of myself I thought I had lost somewhere along the way, hidden beneath the wreckage of a future that would never be. I didn't realize it right away, but healing wasn't some grand epiphany or movie moment. It was 1,000 tiny choices made every day to move forward, even when standing still felt easier, and somewhere between the bad days and the slightly better ones I realized I was starting to breathe easier, starting to laugh at stupid jokes again, starting to imagine a future that didn't make my chest ache with the weight of lost dreams. Spring arrived quietly, without fanfare or grand declarations, but with small gentle shifts that felt more profound than any dramatic change, and one morning I woke up and realized I no longer felt that heavy ache in my chest that used to greet me before my eyes even opened, and in its place there was something lighter, something that felt suspiciously like hope, and it startled me in the best possible way. I started spending more time outside, letting the sun warm my skin and the wind tangle my hair without worrying about who might be waiting for me at home, and in those moments of simplicity I found a kind of freedom I hadn't even realized I had lost. I reconnected with old passions, exploring photography again, walking through farmers markets with a camera slung over my shoulder, capturing strangers' smiles and quiet moments of beauty that reminded me the world was still full of good things, even if some people had chosen to hurt me along the way. It wasn't about replacing what I had lost, it was about building something new from the pieces I still carried, and for the first time, I wasn't looking backward wishing for what could have been. I was looking forward, curious and open to what might come next. It was during one of those slow, sunny afternoons that I met someone new, not in a dramatic storybook kind of way, but in the quiet, ordinary way that real beginnings often happen: a casual conversation over spilled coffee and shared laughter at a local bookstore. That somehow turned into a 3-hour conversation about everything from favorite childhood books to the places we dreamed of seeing someday. Her name was Claire, and she had the kind of energy that didn't demand attention but invited you and made you feel seen without having to fight for it. And when she smiled, it wasn't with the weight of expectation or hidden agendas, it was just pure and simple and kind. We didn't rush anything, we didn't make promises we couldn't keep, we simply existed in each other's orbits, growing closer in the slow, steady way that felt safe and honest and refreshing after all the chaos and heartbreak I had survived. I didn't know where it would lead, and for once I was okay with not knowing, because healing had taught me that love isn't about certainty, it's about choosing someone over and over, even when life gets messy and unpredictable and scary. And I knew that no matter what happened next, I would never again lose myself trying to hold on to someone who didn't want to stay. I had learned that I was enough on my own, that my happiness wasn't something someone else could grant or take away, and that the best love stories aren't the ones that sweep you off your feet, they're the ones that teach you how to stand tall all on your own and invite someone to stand beside you without fear. And as I stood there smiling at Claire over coffee, feeling the first sparks of something new and beautiful blooming quietly between us, I realized that maybe, just maybe, the best chapters of my story were still waiting to be written.